Good evening, and welcome to the Deadline Club's panel discussion on distrust of the media and what can be done about it. I'm Peter Sakay, president of the Deadline Club, and before I turn it over to Steve Dunlop, who will moderate the panel, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Deadline Club. We're the New York City chapter of the Society of Professional Journalists, and we've been around for almost 100 years. We're here to advocate for the rights of journalists. We're here to create a community for journalists, as we're doing right now with this panel and the several other in-person events that we sponsor all throughout the year. We're here to recognize excellence in journalism, as we do with our annual awards contest. And we're here to help up-and-coming journalists with our scholarship awards. If you live or work in the New York City area, we'd love to have you join us. Membership is free if you're already a member of the Society of Professional Journalists. If you're not an SPJ member yet, you can join for less than $80 a year. There's a link to our website in the chat that will tell you how to join SPJ and the Deadline Club. As a Deadline Club member, you'll get discounts on a host of our events, and you'll get access to the Salmagundi Arts Club on Fifth Avenue in the Village, including its bar and restaurant. I hope to see you all at our upcoming events. And now, here's Steve Dunlop to take you through the program.
Thank you, Peter, and good evening, everyone. We have a lot to get through, and during this important discussion, we'll be asking our own questions and be on the lookout for yours. If you have a question, just enter it into the chat bar. We'll look forward to challenging the panel with some of those questions a little later on. Before I introduce our panel, I think we need to take a step back and look at the big picture. So I'm going to jump in and do a screen share if we can. And here we go. Seek truth and report it are the first words of SPJ's Code of Ethics, which for many of us in this divided era bring to mind the classic question of Pontius Pilate to Jesus of Nazareth 2,000 years ago. What is truth? If Pilate had a smartphone today, and as you can see, we created that image with AI, it would return some 2.9 billion results in less than a second. And that, in some respects, represents the present dilemma of the Fourth Estate. 2 or 3 generations ago, readers and viewers used to trust journalists to seek out truth and separate it from falsehood. That's me, starting my radio career in 1974 as a cub reporter, just 2 years after the Gallup organization started tracking America's trust in the news media. It was the year the Watergate scandal dominated the nation's headlines and culminated in the historic impeachment and resignation of President Nixon. 2 years later, Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford portrayed the Washington Post reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, who helped break the scandal wide open, of course, in the Hollywood blockbuster All the President's Men. Journalism was thought of as a noble calling. Since those days, Americans' trust in the news media began a slow and steady decline. Gallup has asked the same question since 1972, and this is a Gallup slide. In general, how much trust and confidence do you have in the mass media, such as the newspapers, radio, TV, when it comes to reporting the news fully, accurately, and fairly? A great deal, a fair amount, not very much, or none at all. The Gallup chart here shows trust reached a high point in 1976, when 72% said they had a great deal or a fair amount of media trust. Unfortunately, Gallup stopped asking the trust question for 21 years. That's where you see the straight line there. And by the time it resumed in 1997, media trust had dropped to 53%. Today, that figure stands at just 34%. And what's more, the reputation of journalism as an ethical profession now stands at the 4th lowest on this chart, not far above car salespeople, telemarketers, and surprise, surprise, members of Congress. Take a deeper dive and you'll see just how far journalists have fallen. Here's a look at the full data set, along with a link where you can study it for yourself. What's most striking is looking at how our extreme negatives have risen. In 1976, just 3% of those surveyed had a very low opinion of us. By 2020, that very low rating had risen to 22%. Clearly, we are no longer seen in the positive light we were decades ago. And when we try to debunk blatant falsehoods, which spread with such ease, of course, in the digital age, we often find ourselves as the targets. So what happened? Has the world changed? Have journalists changed? When presented with facts, are our readers and viewers becoming more like the Jeff Bridges character in The Great Lebowski?
That's just like your opinion, man.
What factors are at play in the growth of media distrust? Industry economics, for instance, evolving technology, polarization and partnership and partisanship, ethical lapses on the part of journalists, and allowing our opinions to seep into fact-based reporting, larger societal trends, and maybe our failure to speak to the needs of all our audiences. And are there any ways in which trust in the news media might begin to be restored? Our panelists tonight: Gerard Baker, editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal, where he authors the weekly op-ed Free Expression. Mr. Baker titled a recent column, "How American Institutions Went from Trust to Bust," excerpted from his book American Breakdown, where he argued a key factor driving mistrust is the widening cultural gap between the people who have led and thrived in our major institutions and the rest of the population. He's a past Deadline Club Awards keynote speaker. Rod Hicks, SPJ's Director of Ethics and Diversity. Several years ago, Mr. Hicks organized one of the most unorthodox SPJ programs ever, the Casper Project, which took a deep dive into the sources of media distrust. The initiative was centered in Casper, Wyoming, the state that, according to Gallup, ranks highest in citizen mistrust of the media. Before assuming his SPJ role, Mr. Hicks served as an editor for the Associated Press at its Philadelphia-based East Regional Desk. He's also served as a newspaper editor in 4 states. And Joy Mayer, founder of Trusting News, a project that trains journalists to demonstrate credibility and earn trust in their day-to-day work. Ms. Mayer spent 20 years in newsrooms as well as teaching at the Missouri School of Journalism, and currently conducts an online course entitled How Any Journalist Can Earn Trust, in association with the Donald W. Reynolds Journalism Institute and the American Press Institute. I'm your moderator, Steve Dunlop, formerly of CBS News, Reuters, and Fox 5 here in New York, now head of a communications training firm, Dunlop Media. So let's dive right in. Gerard Baker, let me start with you. You are not just editor-at-large for the Journal, but you spent 5 years as editor-in-chief of that publication. What was it in your recent experience that drew you to the larger topic of Americans' declining trust generally? So powerfully were you drawn to it that you decided to write a book about it?
Well, thank you, Steve. Thanks very much for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. And thank you all for tuning in. Well, it wasn't really a recent development. It wasn't anything that's happened, particularly recently, although we'll talk about the way in which I think the media has particularly lost trust over the last 5 years. But I've been a journalist now for 35 years, I think a little bit more than that, getting on for 40 years. And I began, you can tell from my accent, I started in the UK in the 1980s, and then I moved to the United States in the 1990s. And I worked for British and American news organizations. And it's been clear to me over the course of that career, I hope these two events aren't connected, that over the course of it's been over the course of my career that people have lost trust in very great numbers in the media. You laid it out there very well in your introduction, that Gallup poll, which I cite in my book, American Breakdown, about the loss of trust in all institutions. That Gallup poll that you cite there captures it very, 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 very well. Again, so what led me to want to write? In fact, what led me to want to write about the decline in trust in U.S. institutions overall, which is what the book is about, including the media, but higher education, K through 12 education, the permanent government, big business, technology companies, big science, public health, medicine. All of these institutions have seen catastrophic declines in trust. But what sparked my interest in that was my own knowledge, my own experience of what I'd seen in journalism. And what I'd seen in journalism, frankly, Steve, over 35 years was a decline in standards in terms of you laid out very well there, I thought, what some of the reasons why trust has declined, but a decline in standards, a decline in and a radical change in the way I think in many journalists themselves. Again, I've been a journalist long enough to have kind of gone from a period where journalists largely back in the 50 years ago were largely interested in finding out the truth about stories, finding out what happened, the famous questions, the where, what, why, when questions, to wanting to being a rather different class of journalists now that wants to tell people what to think. I mean, it's almost that they don't. It's not good enough for them to sort of tell people what happened. There's a class. The journalism is now populated by a class of people that actually wants to. It's highly educated. Again, very different from the sort of traditional journalistic role, where often many of them would not have been to university, let alone to a Ivy League university or to a very a very prestigious university. You now have a journalism which is a professional business, populated by people who, again, I've said, have been very expensively educated, very much at the high end of the educational spectrum, who don't see it as their job, have not seen it as their job to simply find out what happened and tell people, but they have a kind of a mission, an agenda, a belief in a kind of proselytizing belief in their role. And I think that more than anything, and lots of other reasons, and again, you touched on them, but having witnessed that up close in my own lifetime and seen, by the way, to some extent, I'm a product of that, right? I went to a very famous university and I became a journalist. And so I've seen that transformation in the journalistic profession away from reporting, if you like, as a tool, the pursuit of truth, the pursuit of objectivity, to an age now where actually we have many journalists who very publicly decry objectivity, decry the very notion of trying to find out as close to the objective truth as we can. Instead, they believe in moral clarity and their obligation somehow to tell people how the world really works and to play a more didactic role rather than an informational role. So I think it is that. Most of all, there are lots and lots of reasons why trust has declined, but it's that more than anything, the self-elevation of so many journalists into, as I say, kind of proselytizers, into didacticists, into a kind of a modern priesthood, if you like, to whom the truth has been revealed and whose obligation it is to share that truth with the sort of the great unwashed. It's that demographic, that sociological transformation of journalism, and of the journalists who work in the business that I think is most responsible for the fact that people have lost a huge amount of faith in them.
But Gerard, hasn't society changed as well? I mean, in your book, we always talk now about how many truths are out there, right? Your truth, my truth, their truth, his truth, her truth. And you say in your book, actually, that the term post-truth society, which has become something of a buzzword, doesn't quite hit the mark. That what we actually have is a two-truth society, which of course means a no-truth society. Those are your words. Could you expand on that before I move on?
Yeah, so a lot of people have talked about post-truth, the post-truth society, this idea that, again, there is, this goes back, by the way, so it has all kinds of intellectual antecedents, perhaps most recently the kind of postmodernists who emerged in the kind of the 1960s and 70s, this idea that truth itself was a kind of was a construct that was developed by it was all about power structures, and it was developed by the existing power structure. And there was no really such thing as truth. There were all kinds of people had different truths. So we talk a lot about post-truth. And that's been a very, as you say, a buzzword over the last 10 years or so, as we've seen, the idea that there is the role that journalists used to play, supposedly, at least they saw themselves as providing, something, again, an approximation to the truth. That's broken down in the last 10 years or so. And so we have this idea that there are different truths, or there are different conceptions of the truth. My point about there being two is that it's not quite true that we have a post-truth society, because what we have is, in fact, as I say, broadly speaking, we have two truths. We're a highly partisan society, a highly polarized society. Another of the big reasons why trust in journalism has declined, why trust in many institutions has declined. We're a highly polarized, you're sort of, on the left or the right. And you now essentially no longer even have to be exposed to the, quote, objective truth. You only have to actually absorb a truth that suits you. I mean, we all know that, again, one of the most pernicious forms of bias in life generally, particularly in the media, is not so much, and I don't find this very often at all in journalism, not so much journalists overtly telling a lie, overtly deliberately misrepresenting something that happened. The much more powerful bias is selection bias, story selection bias. You choose which stories that are going to highlight. If you choose a story about, something that illustrates, the perils of the terrible inequality of American society, if you keep repeatedly emphasizing that represents a particular view. If you choose to emphasize stories that represent that emphasize the efficiency of New York, of the U.S. economy, then you're producing that truth. Both those stories, by the way, are true, or both those sets of stories are true, but they just speak to different larger truths about the kind of society we think America is. So that's what we have. And we have it as a result of technology, of social media, and indeed of other technological innovations. We have a situation now where people are allowed to choose the story they want to listen to, or the set of stories they want to listen to. There was a very famous Daniel Patrick Moynihan, the New York senator in the 1960s and 70s, the great very iconic figure, famously said, back in the 1970s, I think it was, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. Well, we now have a situation where, I'm sorry, Senator Moynihan, that's no longer true. People are or feel entitled to their own facts. They can choose their own facts. If I want to subscribe to a particular news organization, or I want to hang out with the particular people on social media, or choose to listen to listen to any particular television or radio, or to choose to follow people on social media or on media generally, I can insulate myself from any truth, any facts that actually challenges my chosen narrative, my chosen ideology. And that's really, again, that's part of that's another of the factors that has contributed to this decline in trust, because actually it's in what you have, and you'll see this from the data if you dig more deeply into the data, people trust their own media. If you're a progressive, if you're someone on the left, you trust the New York Times implicitly. And one of the reasons the New York Times has added so many subscribers in the last 10 years is because it's attracted people who want that particular take on the news. If you're a Fox News viewer, you trust what's on Fox News. You don't trust what's in the New York Times, and you trust what's on Fox News. If you're a New York Times reader, you don't trust what's on Fox News. You trust what's in the Times. So that's what I meant by
that in other words becomes your truth.
Yeah, and again, just to clarify, and of course, if you have two truths, then yes, there is no such thing. You can have two different sets of facts that tell you two different stories, but you can't have two truths. I mean, you can't have two diametrically opposed truths. And of course, that is in a sense what we've got. The danger that we've got ourselves into is that we don't really have a kind of we've lost the idea of objective truth. We have either liberal truth or conservative truth, and again, which is no truth at all.
I want to bring Rod Hicks in because Rod, were clearly drawn to the topic of declining media trust so strongly as well, that you embarked on this unusual project, boots on the ground, in 2019 in the state ranked highest in media distrust, a kind of a listening tour, I suppose. Can you give us an overview of what you found? And I'd love for you to fold in your impressions of truth as the people in Casper, Wyoming saw it.
The first thing I want to do is add to something that Gerard said. Yes, you may have facts that you select that you want to believe in, but that does not make those facts or true facts. You can believe what you want to believe, but that doesn't make it factual. What I did in Wyoming was I wanted to, one, try to get a better understanding just by talking to people face to face about why they distrust the mainstream media. And what we had was, I went there, it was a 6-month project. I went there 7 or 8 times. And I usually stayed for about a week. And we brought in speakers, presenters talking about, different topics. Bias was one topic, for example. We also had a panel of local journalists right there in Casper from TV. There was a website, a very popular news site, TV station, and the local newspaper, which was the largest newspaper in the state. And then we had national journalists come in. We had somebody from the Wall Street Journal, from the Associated Press, the Washington Post, and BuzzFeed News. And the participants, we had 36 people from Casper who got to participate in these forums and ask whatever questions they had to challenge these news organizations, right? One of the things that I had hoped is that through the discussions that we had, that the people in Casper would see the hard work that journalists go into getting factual information and trying to cover stories that are meaningful in the local communities. I did not expect a lot of people to say, oh, yeah, now I trust the media. But I thought maybe one or two might come close to saying that. That did not happen. We asked, first of all, what media do you consume? And at the end of the project, people basically still consume the same media, right? We ask, we asked for their ideas about the biggest problem with the mainstream media. That didn't change either. And by the way, it's what this group said was bias, which I found very interesting, that they say that bias is the biggest problem with the mainstream news media, because most of the conservatives in the group, their number one news medium of choice was Fox News, which makes no bones about the fact that they bring you news from a conservative perspective. A lot of interesting things came out there. This project was in 2019. Donald Trump had been the president for 2 years, and we did not say that this is going to be about national news or local news. We just asked them, we talked about news in general. But Donald Trump came up in every session raised by the people in the audience. And the thing that I just couldn't understand is that they did not like the coverage because of Donald Trump in the national media, and to a lesser extent, the local media, because it was all negative. They did not seem to accept that Donald Trump does a lot of negative things. And the thing that I really don't understand is, I don't care who I voted for any office. I want to know what they're doing. I want them to be held accountable, and I want to know that they're working in my interest and not in their own interest or any other interest. I don't know. This group of people, the ones who identified themselves as conservative, didn't seem to care about that, and I'm dumbfounded by that.
Did you find yourself, I mean, how would you sum it up, Rod? Would you say you were kind of talking past each other?
Well, one of the things that the most vocal members of this group said is that they really appreciated the project. To have Casper involved in a national project, to have been selected to come in and question the Washington Post. The person from the Washington Post was the one who edited the stories about the Mueller investigation. They got to ask that Washington Post journalist anything that they wanted, and they appreciated that. I think the biggest takeaway is that they want to be heard. They want to know that these big institutions know what they think about them, and also they try to persuade them to try to do coverage in a way that they appreciated it, that they would like. But even though their minds weren't changed, they were glad that we were there, and they're glad they had the opportunity to talk to these people who are in charge of news organizations, news operations.
Joy Mayer, this is the perfect segue into you. You've worked both as a journalist and as a media educator, and you founded this initiative called the Trust Project. What is it? And I'm curious where you come down on all of this, everything you've heard so far from Gerard and Rod.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I founded Trusting News in January 2016 after realizing that in a small community newsroom where I was working and leading a team of students in Columbia, Missouri, more and more people did not have faith in the basic integrity of what journalists were doing. It didn't much matter how we tried to engage people in the specific content we were working on, the specific local issues that our community was grappling with, if people did not see journalists as a force for good, which is so often the case now, that people don't see journalism as being good for society. They don't believe in our basic benevolence. They don't think we care if what we're doing, how that impacts society. They don't believe in our basic integrity. They think we're out to trick them. So this wasn't even quite as true in 2016. I thought the problem would get better faster, and instead Instead, the work is only more needed. You know, the question that, and Rod and I have spent some time talking about this issue. The question we've been asking lately at Trusting News is, who would feel seen and understood by your journalism, and who might feel neglected or misrepresented by your journalism? And you know, one of the ways we look at that is through a lens of who's on staff. Newsrooms have a sameness about them a lot of times, what the researchers call social homophily. The social sorting that the country is going through happens in newsrooms as well. And you know, Gerard made the great point that newsrooms used to have more blue collar folks, more people who come from different kinds of backgrounds. We used to have more military veterans. I'm sure we used to have more people who attended worship services regularly, more people from small towns. And now 22% of journalists live in New York, DC, or LA. So if you are sitting in Casper, Wyoming, consuming national news, you're getting it from somebody who lives in a big blue city and is surrounded by people who live in and probably come from big blue cities. And so the question of, do you feel seen and understood by journalism? Do you feel like journalism is made for or by people like you? Is actually really complex. And I talk to journalists who live in cities like New York all the time, who really don't know anybody, who don't have a deep understanding of people who just fundamentally see the world differently. So we can look at partisan politics, and there's certainly a lot to, when it comes to truth, there's a lot we could drill down on in terms of, you know, fairness of elections and that sort of thing. But especially when we talk about a community like Casper, I would ask, how many of the national journalists covering guns and gun safety in this country either come from or have a deep, nuanced understanding of all the different relationships that people have to guns and all the reasons that people have guns in their houses? So I don't actually find it at all surprising that a lot of people in a community like Casper don't feel that don't see themselves, and I would say don't see their truth, don't see their reality, don't see their experiences reflected in national news.
We've talked a lot about bias so far, implicit, explicit, however it's defined, and what is truth. People have different perceptions of what the truth is. I'd like to jump back in and advance these slides a little bit and talk a little bit about, and I'm going to try to see if I can do this full screen without it automatically playing like it did the last time. Okay. Accuracy is something that the Gallup organization has been following with a particular question beginning in 1985. And we haven't talked about accuracy yet, and maybe there's a fine line, or there's a fine distinction between the perceived bias of journalists on the one hand and people saying, well, that they got that story wrong, right? Did they get the story wrong? So the question that Gallup asked, in general, do you think news organization stories and reports are often inaccurate? Now, 1985 was the first year that question was asked. It seems to have been the high point for public confidence in our ability to get the facts straight. If you look at the figures, it appears to have stumbled in 1988 and then reached a low, and this struck me when I looked at this chart, in December of 2000, which coincides directly with the Bush versus Gore election recount battle, which strictly speaking wasn't a media accuracy issue, but it was a polarizing political issue about the integrity of our election. Our positive accuracy rating has not climbed back above 50% in this century. And in fact, it seems to have taken another hit in 2003. And the timing there correlates both with the New York Times Jason Blair scandal, which a lot of you may remember, and the Iraq War faulty weapons of mass destruction argument put forward by the George W. Bush administration. So I'm curious how any of you would interpret what we just saw there through the accuracy lens and not just through the bias lens. I'll open it up to anybody on this one.
I'll have a go quickly first on that. I think it's less to do with the specific events that you cite there, Steve, although I'm sure they did play a role. And by the way, I do think, you know, episodes probably like the Iraq War, weapons of mass destruction, and again, I talk about this a lot in my book, played a broad role in undermining trust in all kinds of institutions, the government most importantly, but to some extent, the media, who largely faithfully related those findings, which turned out obviously to be deeply flawed. I think it's less to do though with those specific events. I would say the turning point there that coincides with this is the advent of new technology. And what I particularly mean by that is, so when the internet came along in the 1990s, That was the moment when people, for the first time, were given alternative sources and alternative tools to discover information. I mean, up until, this is very much the era I grew up in, especially in Britain, where we didn't even have 150 cable channels until the early 1980s. In Britain, we basically had 4 television channels all doing the news, and we had radio, and we had 12 national newspapers. That was it. That was those were the sources of news. And, the newspapers tended to be highly partisan. So if you were conservative, you subscribed to a particular paper. And if you were a socialist, you subscribed to another. But the television news channels in particular, to some extent the radio, purported to be objective. You had a similar thing here. I mean, I visited the United States many times in the 1980s, and I've studied this a lot. In the 1970s and 80s were kind of the heyday of the nightly news phenomenon, right? I mean, you look back at those audience figures back in the 1970s and 80s for those 3 main news, nightly news, the other way, Dan Rather. In the 80s, it was Dan Rather, Tom Brokaw, and Peter Jennings. Before that, it had been Cronkite and Chancellor and all these people. The numbers of people who watched those shows in the 70s and the 80s was astonishingly large. I think between them, something like 30 or 40 million people, maybe, I mean, at its peak, I think more than 50 million Americans, adult Americans. That was getting on for, that was more than a third of the population would tune into one of those shows. And, we used to talk about it in a kind of semi-joking way as the voice of God. That was the voice of God. When, Dan Rather, or God help us, or Walter Cronkite, particularly in the 60s and 70s, told us the news that evening, that was it. That was the objective news. There was no challenging it. There was no doubt about it. This is what happened. That's part of our world tonight, or whatever it was that, Dan Rather used to say. And generally speaking, people trusted it because they didn't really have any means of verifying it. What happened in the late 90s and then in the early 2000s, people were able to get all kinds of alternative sources of information. So, if you lived in St. Louis, you'd watch the main news channels. Before Fox News came along, you only really had CNN, MSNBC, or NBC, as it was in its very early stages back then. You didn't really have Fox News. You had CNN, and you had the main news, and you'd have your local newspaper, the major regional newspaper, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. Suddenly, when first of all, other cable news came along, and most importantly, when the internet came along, you suddenly had access to every single source of information that was out there in the world, and you could then start to see what you were being told on NBC Nightly News, which was still going, and indeed still is to this day, or you could see what you were being told on CNN. Or you could read what you were being told in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and you could read actually a different version of events from a different news organization, either a different traditional news organization or a completely new startup, something that had never existed before. And you could actually start to challenge what you were being told by this institution that you'd always trusted. And you could even do better than that. You could go to the raw facts. So, again, one of the things that we all do as journalists is the 95% of journalism is editing, right? There's a huge amount of things going on. When somebody gives a speech may last. Donald Trump may give a speech that lasts an hour and 20 minutes. We pick especially when in the days of the nightly news, you'd pick 20 seconds of that, a 20-second soundbite of that. Now that would be again, taking it back into the 80s, 70s, and 80s, that's all people could see. They couldn't see the speech itself unless they happened to attend it. They weren't going to be able to see it. They could then, when the internet came along and people could go online and could watch these speeches or read the transcripts, they could actually say, well, actually, maybe that excerpt that I saw on the nightly news was a little bit distorting. It was highly selective. It didn't actually fit in with the broader pattern. I think this went on over and over and over again. And people started to say, what the point I'm making here is that, of course, the news had, I've explained why I think the official news institutions have become much more partisan and much more unreliable and politically biased in the last 20 years. But I think to some extent they always were, and people just couldn't really have any particular means of verifying it, of testing what they were being told. When the internet came along, especially as it became more sophisticated and internet speeds increased, by the early 2000s, everybody could literally have access to all the raw information on which news organizations were making their judgments. They could listen to other views, they could get other information, they could find things that would never, ever, ever appear in the New York Times or on CNN about whether it might be about, guns or abortion or or international politics or anything like that. They suddenly had much more information, and so their reliance, first of all, on those traditional sources of information rapidly declined. And when they started to see alternative sources of information and to rely on alternative sources of information, their trust in those traditional sources of information declined even more rapidly. So I think it was less those specific events, although I'm sure they played a role, and much more the advent of this technology that just gave people access to information they had never had before, and it could really undermine the trust that they'd had in traditional news organizations.
You actually reminded me of a statistic that I've carried around in my head for a long time, and it goes to television news and what we used to call the incredible shrinking soundbite. In 1968, the length of the average soundbite on the three major networks was something like 58 seconds. Imagine that, 58 seconds. And by 2000, the year that we're examining right now, it was down to 12 seconds. And it's so technology was already starting that long march, because you moved from film to video. It became easier to compress sound bites than it was with film, which was very unwieldy. But to your point about .coms, I don't know how many of you got news alerts today when Kevin McCarthy was ousted as House Speaker. On my smartphone, and this is my pet peeve, and I'd be curious to hear what the rest of you have to say about it. The news alerts from major organizations, Wall Street Journal, Gerard, your publication, Kevin McCarthy has been removed as House Speaker, first time in U.S. history. From my local paper, LOHUD, Kevin McCarthy vote results, Speaker ousted after deal to avert government shutdown. Apple News relaying a blast from Fox News simply said, Kevin McCarthy's future as House Speaker decided. What does that alert make you do? It makes you want to click on the alert, and all of a sudden, what's supposed to be a brief, informative blast has become clickbait for you. So I'm just curious if any of you given any thought to whether people out there may feel like we're playing them. Thoughts?
Oh, we're completely playing them. I mean, if you look at the recent research, I've been so excited when new research comes out about news fatigue and news avoidance, because we produce something that is miserable to consume. We produce something that leaves people feeling stupid because we talk to other news junkies and we don't give people room to catch up. We produce something that makes people feel overwhelmed, like there's nothing they can do about it. We produce something that exhausts people because there's just there's always more and more of it. If you think back to the earlier news era that we're dissecting here, think about the relief that would come from having a news product that you get to the end of, whether that's a broadcast or a print newspaper. News just goes on and on and on. And one other point I'll make about the earlier news era is that even before the 90s and 2000, if you look at the 80s and the rise of talk radio, that's Rush Limbaugh's years. If you look at the 90s and the rise of cable TV, really what we're talking about is filter failure and confirmation bias. As it became easier for people to choose news that confirmed how they saw the world, then they had less and less faith in sort of the one narrative that was being produced by those big three stations.
Joy, that's really the point that I was going to make when I was listening to Gerard speak. In the 90s, and you're right, what Rush Limbaugh was in the 80s, I believe. But in the 90s and with Rush Limbaugh in the 80s, you saw politics becoming more of a thing in people's lives. Newt Gingrich with his contract with America was helped elevate politics to a higher level than what we were accustomed to, and that continued on with Ronald Reagan. And so now being conservative has a lot to do with politics, and you look at where it is today, where that's almost what totally defines it, is politics. And as we know, Republicans distrust the news media at a much higher rate than all other news consumers. And so now you have this thing, it's the, the lines are drawn. You are liberal and trust mainstream media, or you are conservative and don't trust mainstream media, but you do trust conservative media. So, and out in Casper, all they wanted to talk about, I mentioned that they brought up Donald Trump, but everything was talked about in terms of politics, which that I don't remember that being the case, earlier. I graduated from college in 1985, and there was politics and people talked about it, but people did not identify themselves so closely with politics, and everything started blending together even further when you had people like Newt Gingrich and later on Donald Trump really meshing the two and saying that the liberal media does not like you and they're your enemy and things like that. And so that's where we are today.
So is it fair to say then that maybe you walked away with the feeling from Wyoming, Rod Hicks, that Trump may not have necessarily been the cause of the distrust you saw there, but maybe more the result?
I think Donald Trump, we know that it started, decades ago, 50 years ago, at least, maybe even further than that. But what Donald Trump saw was an opportunity to exploit it. And that's what he did. And people got on board with it because they start thinking about, in my view, they start thinking about what it is that they see. And, as Joy has said, and conservatives really don't see the issues that they care about most dealt with in mainstream media in a way that they want to see them discussed. And so if you already have this notion that you're not getting properly served by mainstream media, and then the president of the United States, who deals with reporters all the time, says, yeah, they don't care about you, they hate you, they make up sources, they're your enemy. I think that resonates with people, given what they already have in their heads.
Yeah, I've always thought that. And I just quickly, I think that's exactly right. I think, look, I do. My heart sinks when pretty well every single conversation one has about any aspect of culture in this country, within minutes, the name Donald Trump comes up, and it's a shame that we are so completely dominated by this figure. I think Donald Trump has contributed significantly, and I say this in the book, to a culture of mistrust. I think he has a notoriously loose relationship with the truth himself, and he has fed a culture of mistrust. But I think it's really important. I think this is what Rod's getting at this here, that Trump didn't create this problem. Trump, exactly as you said, Steve, Trump is much more a product of this problem, or a reflection of this problem, or a symptom or an outcrop of this problem, than he is the cause of it. There was this enormous mistrust that people had of the media, conservatives particularly, to some extent others too, but heavily conservatives, because they felt that they had been either ignored or their views misrepresented, or they felt the media were dominated by liberal progressives. And frankly, who's to argue with them? We see all these surveys of journalists, where the vast majority of we'll have a lot of fun with some the famous stories, the famous Pauline Kael story from 1972, saying the New Yorker columnist saying, I can't believe Richard Nixon won the election because I don't know anybody who voted for him. Or the other stories that we've had, I've done this myself. I've been in a room full of people in a newsroom, and people have been asked, how many people in this room voted for Donald Trump? Not a hand goes up. And then, okay, maybe they don't want to say how they voted, and I think that's reasonable. How many of these people in this room know someone who voted for Donald Trump? Still not a hand goes up. No,
and respect, right?
Exactly. This is, so I don't think, to be fair to conservatives, obviously I would say that, this is somehow made up or some sort of, problem that they have. It is the fact that the media the mainstream media, term I hate, but the major news organizations, the traditional news organizations, are absolutely dominated by people who tend to share the same broad political ideological outlook. And exactly as Joyce said at the beginning, come from the same geographic backgrounds, the same educational backgrounds, the same socioeconomic, the same cultural, religious or lack of religion. They not one of them owns a gun, not one of them goes to church, or synagogue or whatever. They are different. They are a completely different class of people from, not everybody in the country, but from a very, very large number of people in the country who feel unrepresented.
This is a good time to talk about the fact that Donald Trump wasn't the first to tap into this resentment among a large portion of the population. A little bit of history. On November 3rd, 1969, with the Vietnam War raging, President Nixon gave a nationally televised address that later became known as the Vietnamization speech, a plan to turn over more and more of the fighting to the South Vietnamese and prepare for an eventual American exit. But the analysis on all three of the networks at the time was highly critical of Nixon. And I'm going to jump in here and do a little screen share for something that is, we're supposed to be current, but this one is 54 years old. I'm going to have to scroll down and get it. Here we go. Okay. I don't know if you can see this. Hopefully you can. This is Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, who later had to resign, by the way, after being accused of bribery. Spiro Agnew he launched a broadside. It was a real turning point because no administration had ever done this to the news media. He launched a broadside against what he called the small number of network commentators who wield tremendous power over the country. This clip is worth listening to because of how it really presages our present era. It's about 1:15. Let's have a listen.
Now, what do Americans know of the men who wield this power? Of the men who produce and direct the network news, the nation knows practically nothing. Of the commentators, most Americans know little, other than that they reflect an urbane and assured presence, seemingly well informed on every important matter. We do know that, to a man, these commentators and producers live and work in the geographical and intellectual confines of Washington, D.C. or New York City, the latter of which James Reston terms the most unrepresentative community in the entire United States. Both communities bask in their own provincialism, their own parochialism. We can deduce that these men read the same newspapers. They draw their political and social views from the same sources. Worse, they talk constantly to one another, thereby providing artificial reinforcement to their shared viewpoints.
Now, that speech was in Des Moines, Iowa. And obviously a lot of applause, but it does resonate in a special way, I think, with what we're facing today. I'm just curious if any of you have any reactions to that. It's obviously 54 years old, but in some ways, things never change.
Well, my main reaction, Steve, is you missed out, of course, the great defining line of that speech when he referred to these people as the nattering nabobs of negativism. That was one of the great pieces of alliteration. And that speech, by the way, is a fine example. Even a bad man can actually get things right. Spiro Agnew was a bad man, and as you say, was eventually forced to resign and indicted, I think, on corruption charges. Yeah, but it is interesting. It absolutely does resonate. It is, striking. It is striking, isn't it? One of the things that struck me about it is the cultural difference that he kept referring to men. It was all men. These days, of course, I'm glad to say there's much greater gender representation, so you wouldn't say that. But the basic accusation that you could make about those people driving those major news organizations, you could still say, except with, of course, the big difference now that we have a wider range of news organizations, whether they be digital or TV or indeed, all sorts of other on all sorts of other platforms. But yeah, it does that speech. But the only thing other than his corruption that Spiro Agnew probably will ever be remembered for.
Our other panelists, I'm just curious what your reactions are to that.
The thing that I found interesting is that it did not have the venom that Donald Trump has. I mean, the message is the same, but it wasn't a Donald Trump like delivery.
I'm interested in what actually hasn't come up yet here tonight, and what also isn't in that speech is an acknowledgement of how white newsrooms are. When we look at who feels seen and understood by journalism, I mean, back then certainly it was like not even an issue. It was just sort of understood that newsrooms were run by white people and that communities of color didn't see their own realities reflected in the news, their own experiences and values often reflected in the news. And that's just another thing that factors in today, is that there are a lot of overlaps actually in the research. When you dive into people who don't trust the news, there are a lot of overlaps with different groups of people. And it really comes down to the people making news decisions don't understand me, don't live where I live, don't see the world like I see the world, don't know my people. And so I think race is another factor there.
And gender. I mean, you heard Spiro Agnew say the men who run the show and network news, it was all men in those days. Even SPJ, well, the Deadline Club. I'm trying to remember when we first admitted women to the Deadline Club. It's ancient history now, probably in the 1960s or 70s. But let's face it, we were at one point of kind of a male profession, and thank God we're not anymore. But you're bringing up an interesting point, Joy, and I'd like to do another screen share, because when you say that we are not trusted because we don't live there, we don't work there, we don't see things on the ground that other people see, I'm going to come back here and one more screen share. See if we can find this. Here we go. There's an advantage to being local. I think it was Tip O'Neill, the House Speaker during the Reagan administration, who said all politics is local. Maybe all news is local. We have a slide, another slide from Gallup that's I found fascinating when I discovered it. It compares how people rate their news media locally, their local news media, not the big national news media. Are they too liberal? Are they just about right? Are they too conservative? Look at the sweet spot there, right in the center. And the numbers barely budged over the course of 12 years, from 2007 to 2019. 56% say it's just about right, just about where it should be. And you've got the wings. Some people say it's too liberal on one side, too conservative on the other side. So it would seem to indicate that we trust our local media far more than the national mainstream media. I guess what are the reasons of what are the reasons for that maybe we're not aware of, or maybe, Joy, you've come across some reasons for that we haven't explored yet, other than, hey, people just they know me because I'm local.
Yeah, well, at Trusting News, we work with hundreds of journalists in local newsrooms a year, and certainly have seen the trust declining there as well. Did you say those were 2019 numbers, Steve?
It's I believe 2007 to 2019. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see what those are now. My sense is that they've declined. I think the nationalization of both politics and journalism has meant that national talking points show up more in local newsrooms. I'm in Sarasota, Florida, where critical race theory and gender politics are showing up in my local school board. I think that so I do think that the perceptions of bias in local news are unfortunately going the wrong direction as well. And that, by the way, is among independents, not just conservatives, are seeing more political bias in news. I will say, though, that the same phenomenon, there's longstanding research that people don't trust Congress, but trust their congressperson. And there is sort of my media versus the media research that suggests the same thing, that people do have more trust in their local news. But the flip side of that, I was in Oklahoma last week doing a training with about 40 journalists there that done some statewide research about what people across Oklahoma think about the news. And people who have been serving their communities as journalists for decades say that their relationship with their community has changed. They are absolutely more trusted than regional news and absolutely more trusted than national news, but the levels of distrust have grown. The levels of sort of suspicion about their motives and integrity have risen.
When you're living in a your local community, and a big story happens, and then the national media comes there and do all these stories about it. What happens sometimes is the people who live there feel like their city has been caricatured, They also, some well-known institutions in the area are mispronounced or left out, significant data. It's like the national journalists come in and they don't get the nuances of the local community, and people there notice it. And I think that just adds fuel to it. One of the first sessions I did when I started working for SPJ was in Baltimore, and we were revisiting the Freddie Gray case, you know, the guy who was put in a police van and somehow ended up dead. Well, it was a public forum, and people there talked about how, you know, a couple of things. That it was obvious that many of the national journalists didn't know the town. They didn't know the history of the town. And when they would show pictures of buildings on fire, that happened, I guess, once or twice. But the TV news, they specified CNN. I don't know, but they said CNN would run the same video of burning buildings, leaving the impression is that that was still happening when it was days or even weeks ago. So when you live in a town and that's your experience when the national media comes on, it helps to, I think, reinforce your distrust or dislike of national media.
And I just very quickly pick up on
Sorry, go ahead, Gerard.
what Joyce said, just very quickly pick up on what Joyce said. And I talk about this in my book. Sorry to keep plugging my book, but it's really striking actually that as she says, as exactly as she says, it's not just media. It is on almost every level. People have much higher levels of trust in something that is closer to them and more local to them than they do in a national institution. So exactly as you say, they don't like Congress, but they like their local congressman. Big business, local business, there's a huge gap. In fact, in the book, I cite these data from Gallup. Gallup conducts these polls, as you've been saying, Steve, has been doing it for 50 years. They've been polling public views of about 16 or 17 institutions over almost all of that time. There are only two institutions that have seen their trust levels stay above 50% or actually increase. One is the military, for I think reasons we probably sort of all understand. The other is small business, local business. They trust small business and local business. And I think, again, I talk about this as part of the solutions in my book, that I think the more we can maybe devolve authority and power and reduce scale and make people feel that they have more accountability over their lives and over the institutions that control their lives, I think the better we do. But it is a very striking phenomenon that they are very distrustful of big, large, national, international, multinational institutions, and much more trusting of institutions that are closer to them.
Do you think, Rod, that it's possible? I'm sorry. Do you think it's possible that national journalists can do that? Or is it just?
So I think part of the answer, and I do think, I think Joy again touched on this in her right at the beginning, when I do think part of the problem is that national journalists are themselves. I mean, with national journalists, it's both geographic, but kind of socioeconomic and ideological distance from people. One of the things I did when I was editor of the Wall Street Journal, we made a very conscious effort to increase our hiring among people. You know, we had similar situation where the vast majority of our journalists, you know, either were from the sort of the four major metropolises in this country, from New York, LA, San Francisco, or Washington DC, the bi-coastal metropolises at least. And we made a conscious effort to actually find people who came from a different geographic background, a different cultural background. And I think that's part of the answer, Rod. I don't think you can, you can also try to make maybe some of that national coverage. You could try, national institutions maybe have the reach and the power to make some of their coverage more local and to reach in and cover things in a more local way. But I do think it's partly about representing the people out in different parts of the country, in parts that are very, very underrepresented in newsrooms. That would be a way. That would be at least a kind of an oblique way of tackling that problem and getting to the solution of getting people and institutions that are closer to the people who actually consume this information.
Something's bothering me here, and I'm curious if it's how you all square this feeling of more trust at a local level. If you keep journalism local, if you keep the reporting local, we've had a 30% decrease in the country's local newspaper headcount since 2004. that doesn't make sense.
Might be, might be why people trusted. No, I'm being facetious. Well, we've actually, you're right. I mean, local newspapers have been, and that's a real problem. And it's a real problem for local accountability and the accountability of local government and business. And that is a problem. But what you have seen the growth of, and I think you're seeing more of it, is the growth of so-called hyper-local journalism, right? Which is that more and more, you've seen a sharp decline in big city newspapers. Some of them have literally gone under completely. Many of them have been reduced to a shell of their former selves. Some of the biggest cities in America have newspapers now, or major news organizations that are a fraction of what they used to be. But you've seen instead the growth of these obviously almost entirely digital operations that are very, very local. I mean, literally not covering South Bend, Indiana, but covering an area of 5 square miles of South Bend, Indiana, or whatever. And I think there's some hope there. I mean, it is a problem that at the political level, we have lost a lot of reporting capability, which is weakening the accountability of those institutions. But I do think people are hungry still for information. The fact that they have trust in local news organizations does represent an opportunity for more and more local, very, very local reporting.
Well, I think much of it has to do with, one, economics, and two, with the growth of all these digital products that we have that are delivering information. Some of it news, some of it not news, but people consider it news. What has happened is, as the internet came along, and now social media came along, and cell phones came along, and you have people feel like I can get the news that I want without paying for it. And that's one of the things that has helped to kill the newspaper that I worked at for 9 years in Birmingham. No longer exists. It closed about 7 or 8 years ago, and that's happened all over the country. As newspapers. I come from newspapers, including St. Louis, which you gave a shout out to, Gerard. Thanks for that. As the newspapers. It's hard. The old model is not working. The newspapers lost their classified advertising to eBay and Craigslist, and then companies that used to be big advertisers started going direct to consumer through the internet and now social media. And at the same time, people say, "Well, I can find the news I can find the news on my phone, and I don't have to pay for it," and they don't want to pay for it. They want to be informed, I believe, but they don't want to pay for it because they think that there are free alternatives.
Well, the problem is that there usually are. Not always, but it doesn't cost money to watch TV or turn on the radio. And I think that sometimes it was interesting with some of this Oklahoma research. They were talking to people across the state who said, "I don't pay for the news and I don't have any trouble staying informed." So part of that is that there's not as much in those local newspapers as there used to be. Part of it is that local newspapers don't do a good enough job explaining what makes their coverage worthy of money, right? So when I see in a mid-sized city a newspaper with a paywall saying, "Well, news isn't free, you need to pay us if we're going to make the news," which I really do understand, and I think encouraging people to pay for the news is smart, but I also understand the frustration of people saying, "Well, if I Google that, I'm going to get 6 headlines telling me what happened at this thing yesterday, and so why should I pay for one of them and get the rest of them free?" I just think it's worth remembering as journalists that when we talk about news isn't free, that often from a consumer standpoint, it always has been.
I'd like to shift this discussion a little bit because we're focusing on local news, and there's actually an initiative that we're going to be doing another program on, hopefully in the coming weeks or months. You may have heard of it. It's a coalition of 22 large donors that have pledged something like $500 million to support Press Forward, which is a national initiative to support precisely the kind of local journalism that the shuttered newspapers once provided. But there's a diversity angle to this that I'd like to explore. And it's worth looking at, because here's a statement from the Asian American Journalists Association, and this is actually part of a coalition of diversity organizations, asking, for those of us who work in journalism, there isn't a day that passes we don't see how vividly newsrooms are shrinking, news deserts are impacting people. But there is concern on their part about how these new entities that are going to be supporting local journalism are going to be structured. And this was in their joint statement, and I'd like you all to comment on it if we could ask you to do that. Racial and ethnic diversity fosters trust between media outlets and underrepresented communities. Here's the piece that really struck me. When people see themselves and their experiences reflected in the news, they are more likely to engage with it and view journalism as a credible and valuable resource. I'll just open that to your comments.
Part of what I do at SPJ now, I am the director of ethics and diversity. And on the diversity part, what I do is try to help journalists understand and the importance of being inclusive in their coverage. You don't want big gaps of your coverage area ignored. The people in those communities don't want that. And I do see a big link between inclusive coverage and the distrust in the news. I think Joyce said it, it's all the same. Conservatives are fleeing mainstream media because they don't see their ideas covered. People of color don't feel that they have a reason to trust the news because they don't see their communities reflected in them. So I think it's the same problem in both worlds. People need to see themselves, their ideas represented, and if they don't, they don't feel any obligation to support that organization.
I wonder. I mean, the two things I can agree with Rod, and of course, we need to do a better job of ensuring that newsrooms are more reflective of American society. But I say two quick things. One, I think, and Rod hinted on at this. I think it's, to be honest, I think it's just as important, if not more important, to have intellectual and ideological diversity in newsrooms. I think that is a problem, frankly, and I think that's by all means, let's improve diversity on all fronts, but let's make sure that people from with not only African Americans and Hispanics and Asian Americans, but also, gun owners and people who go back to Joy's point, gun owners, or people who go to church every Sunday, or people who practice their religion every week. Maybe they should be represented more too. The other point I'd make, and this is a genuine question and not a comment, not an opinion, or even an observation. I wonder whether it's true that actually having people, who are ethnically diverse, whether people who have whether put it bluntly, whether Latinos trust the news delivered to them by Latinos more than they trust it from white people. I'd be really interested to know, for example, one of the things we've been talking about is the decline of trust overall, and I kind of wonder whether, for example, African Americans trusted Walter Cronkite, or Peter Jennings, or Tom Brokaw, or any of those people. We know that we've been through this. High numbers of Americans did trust them. And I kind of suspect that was probably reflected among. I just don't know, but I'd be interested to know whether that was true. Whether African Americans, obviously Latinos were a much smaller part of the proportion of the population back then, but African Americans in particular, say back in the 70s, whether they shared the broadly high levels of trust that the numbers we have for all Americans tell us that all Americans had. I suspect is probably true. I suspect, again, this is not in any way to say that we don't need more ethnic diversity, but I'm just a little skeptical of the idea that it makes people more. I can understand for all kinds of reasons why it's important to increase diversity, but does it make people intrinsically trust the news more? I mean, if you're, we've seen this with this fascinating political and cultural changes we're seeing in the country at the moment. It's been assumed for a very, very long time that Latinos vote heavily Democratic. It's been true for a very long time, but we're starting to see in the last 4 or 5 years huge numbers of Latinos, according to some polls, even conceivable that a majority of Latinos might vote Republican in the next presidential election. Does that mean that they, a typical, there's no such thing, but a mass of Latino voters or Latina voters would rather get their news, say, from a left-wing, Latina journalist on Univision, or would they rather get their information from a black or a white or a or an Asian American reporting on Fox News. I'm
let me help you out, Gerard.
Yeah.
First of all, Black people or any people of color had no choice between Tom Brokaw and Dan Rather and the people who were doing the news. That's who they were given. That's who they had to listen to. And I'm not saying that, and I don't necessarily believe that people of color think that everybody delivering the news should come from their same ethnic group. But they need to have somebody. When the entire newscast in their town is white people, they're going to believe that there are some cultural things that will be missed in their coverage because nobody there comes from their background and their culture. So it doesn't have to be
I take the point.
I
take the point. It was a genuine question, and of course, you're absolutely right. 50 years ago, there literally were no black faces on, on reading the news or giving us any important information whatsoever. So, but again, I'm just interested whether I suspect that ideological opinion, ideological disposition, and very right back to the original point we made, where people sort of choose their own news now according to whether it fits their own ideological view. Probably that on the specific issue of trust, I suspect that the politics and the ideology for people matters more in terms of what the news sources they trust than the ethnicity of the person delivering the news. But it's a genuine.
Maybe if you're talking about coverage of politics, I think I would agree with you. What I wish is that this country has such a rich history with the black press. I wish we had research from back in the Walter Cronkite era of how many people trusted the black press to express to them their lives and their community, versus coverage of Congress, which is a whole different thing.
Right.
We could go on for a long time on this topic, but I'd like to move on because I don't want us to run out of time before we have a chance to discuss some of the solutions to all these issues involving media trust that we've pinpointed. Joy, I asked you before we began, I was hoping you could kind of lead this conversation or at least kick it off, because trusting news is your kind of your mission statement. And we talked about a couple of areas where you could maybe highlight some examples. And the first one is how important it is for journalists and publications to demonstrate their political independence. And you've actually got a little example of that.
Yeah, you bet. We were talking about how the SPJ Code of Ethics serves as a foundation for so many people. And my colleague Lynn Walsh actually wrote through the Code of Ethics from a trusting news perspective with a tip for each one of how to make ethics visible in your day-to-day life. And in your day-to-day journalism, and one of the points in the SPJ Code of Ethics is be independent. Well, how often do we explain as journalists what that means? So there are some wonderful examples of newsrooms explaining, here's what political independence, here's what being nonpartisan looks like to us, here's what independence looks like to us. One of the examples, Steve, that I had shared with you was from PolitiFact, when they were taking reader questions during the Democratic and Republican conventions during the last cycle. And they asked questions about, why does it seem like you fact check Republicans more than Democrats? Where is your fact checking across the political aisle? And, their editor in her big weekly newsletter just took time to explain, here's what it looks like to us to cover people fairly across the political aisle.
And next one, which I found really interesting, and it's especially germane right now because of the because of the funding that Press Forward hopes to provide to local journalists. That doesn't sound like a for-profit model to me. That sounds like a nonprofit model. The question inevitably would arise: where are you getting this money from, and what is their agenda? Why are they funding your news? So let's talk about that.
Yeah, I stuck a couple links to newsletters we've written on these topics. The first one is about political independence. Financial independence was actually the topic of our newsletter today. My colleague Molly Muchner wrote about the importance of explaining where money comes from. and whether it influences journalism. You know, it's such an early reporter lesson: follow the money, figure out where the money's coming from. And yet journalists don't tell the story of where their own money is coming from. So whether that is your relationship to advertisers, your relationship to local donors, your relationship to people to philanthropy, we actually are not usually on the record about what financial independence looks like. So if, you know, you'll hear on NPR, you'll hear Steve Inskeep say, you know, we're covering Facebook even though we've gotten money from Facebook, because that's how this should work. And I really believe we need more language that explains where does that independence lie. Who, you know, disclosing when people have given us money and they're featured in stories, disclosing, you know, your sort of budget breakdown. There's also research that suggests if we talked more about money, people would be more likely to support us, because people don't understand the financial crisis that local news is in.
I'm going to be asking for some you to start thinking about your closing comments in a minute, but just looking at the chat window, we have a kind of an interesting comment from a Ruth Ann Harnish, and I'm just going to read it out loud and ask for your comments. I helped to fund, Ruth Ann says, journalism education at a well-regarded school. Years into the relationship, a graduate of the J program wrote to me asking for help getting a job. I was aghast. She could not write, and yet she had graduated with a major in journalism. I learned that this school, like almost every other good school, has a writing center which helps students shape up their work before turning it in. All three of you have been editors. I'm curious what your impression is as to the writing skills of young journalists, especially those just coming out of J school.
I just think in general that this industry has evolved a lot. And I believe that some of the ways that we teach journalism haven't evolved to keep up with the way the industry has. It goes beyond writing. It's, you know, how we source information, and how we allow people to tell us lies, and we know that they're lies, but we report them because that's what the person said, and there's no pushback giving. I also think, this is just my opinion, I don't know if any research is about this, that the social media has first email and now social media has gotten people in the habit of being very casual in the way that they write. And as you know, for those of us who grew up without that, you know, we wrote in, you know, proper English, but it's just so casual now. And I think that it overlaps in you know, in the real world when people want to get jobs. I think there should be more emphasis on writing. And I think that we need to go back to, you know, I think more needs to be done to unlearn this little shortcut writing that kids start doing at a very, very young age.
How does poor writing impact on trust? Gerard Baker, I'll just throw that one at you. How does bad writing impact on this big issue we're discussing?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, clarity in writing is essential. Clarity in communication is essential for trust. I mean, people have to understand what you're saying and to be able to you know, absorb what you're saying, and to you know, to make a judgment as whether or not they can trust it. So it is very important. I think that I think I generally agree. I certainly agree with what Roger said. I think that look, I'm as you said, as I said at the beginning, I'm English. I was educated in England. I started out as a journalist in England, and it's long been said, and I think it's absolutely true, that in England, especially in journalism, there is a huge amount of emphasis on the writing, and maybe less emphasis on the reporting and the kind of rigors of reporting. In the United States, I think it's traditionally been the other way around. I think very, very high standards of reporting, much higher, quite frankly, than, you know, the average standards in the UK, in England. That is the thoroughness of reporting, the importance of accuracy, the importance of, you know, multiple sourcing, of, you know, the going through all of the learning and absorbing and implementing and doing journalism that works upon all the rules of journalism, much more rigorous in the United States, and maybe with less emphasis on the writing. You know, in an ideal world, maybe you'd have the best of both. Maybe there should be, there would be, you know, there could be an emphasis on higher quality writing. I have to say, though, you know, having spent time on both sides, I think in terms of trust, if that's what we're talking about, frankly, you know, erring on the side of getting the reporting right and getting the accuracy and the conforming to all of those rules of journalism that we all know and that we all should be following, I think actually that matters more. I'm sure it matters more in terms of establishing trust than being able to, you know, turn a good phrase or quote Ernest Hemingway in an appropriate context or something like that. So I think that, of course, you know, the quality of writing, we should always be working to improve the quality of writing and communication. I think that if that were to result in any sacrifice of the emphasis on the rigors of reporting, then I think it would be a loss.
I'd love to go around the panel and just get on this subject of restoring trust. It's Gerard, you made the point in your book that we have been through periods in this country where trust has been broken at various levels, and it has been restored. That's kind of a hopeful note. And before you end on that hopeful note, I'd like to ask Rod and Joy how they would kind of put a bow on this and help. You know, what would you say in terms of restoring trust? What would you want people to take away from this discussion in terms of restoring media trust?
Yeah, I think that one thing that we have to do is take more care with our work. When journalists make mistakes, there are going to be people who think that it's deliberate. I heard that when I was in Wyoming. So we have to really try hard to get it right. That's the first thing. But we also need to be open to the blind spots that we might have. As Gerard said, or maybe it was Joy, but we all know this, journalists tend to be liberal. And that's the background that we bring to this profession. So we have to be even more aware of the blind spots that we might have when we look at stories and think, you know, am I opening myself up to accepting something from a conservative perspective that I might not be? So just really challenge yourself to make sure that you are at least recognizing your blind spots and trying to address it.
Joy, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I'm 8 years into working with journalists to earn trust. And my primary piece of advice is this: be very, very curious about why people don't trust you. Journalists are naturally curious, and yet somehow when we hear people don't trust us, we get defensive. It's like we think we deserve automatic trust, even though, of course, not everything people read, see, or hear is ethically produced, is responsible, is mission driven. So we can't defend the media. We're not here to defend the media. I get really mad about a lot of things I see that are done in the name of journalism. But I think if journalists would get very curious about who they're not reaching and what they're getting wrong, and then be willing to earn that trust back, be willing to explain, understand that, of course, people don't know how journalism works. They don't know that you have a code of ethics and that you follow it. They don't see evidence of that. They don't understand how you're funded. They don't understand that you correct errors, that they don't know what fairness looks like to you. They don't know who's on your staff and what makes them credible. We don't take time to explain these things within our day-to-day work. And we don't fundamentally start by saying, how could we be doing a better public service? And I am not talking about I'm not talking about spending time trying to earn the trust of people who believe conspiracy theories. That is not most of the country. I am talking about the vast majority of the people you aim to serve care about being informed, care about each other, are interested in staying on the playing field of facts. And if you are not reaching them, then it's on you to figure out why and what you could be doing better and how you could be explaining your work.
Quick note from the chat, question from a recent grad. Is there a journalism code of ethics? Absolutely. Go to spj.org. I think what is it? ethics/ethics code. You'll see it right there. Are there repercussions if it's not followed? That's the next question from the same individual. No, it's voluntary code because, this kind of activity is protected by the First Amendment. Gerard Baker, last thoughts on this.
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts. Firstly, on absolutely the point that Rod made about kind of owning up to, people do think that when we get things wrong, it's done deliberately and it's done with an agenda. I think, and to that last point about, is there an enforcement mechanism for the code of ethics? I think more accountability is needed in journalism. I don't think there is enough accountability. There should be, many more, a much greater willingness to acknowledge errors. Some organizations, to be fair, do this in, and New York Times. I've been critical of the New York Times past, but they've made a big thing out of, errors, big errors that they've been responsible for. But I think more generally, we could learn. We should acknowledge our fallibility, and when we get things wrong, we should give it proper coverage. It's not good enough to put a story on the front page, or leading an app or something like that, which turns out to be wrong, and then to issue a correction that appears 6 weeks later, buried on page 27 or deep down. You've got to scroll through the app to get to it. So I think more accountability would really be valuable. You mentioned at the start, as I say in my book, we have been through periods of terrible mistrust in institutions and in each other before in this country, and the great genius of the United States is it's come through these times. That's the good news, is it has come through these times. The bad news is obviously that on at least one occasion it took a civil war to do it, and to both to restore trust and to right a terrible evil, which was at the root of the mistrust. Now, I don't think the problems we have today, thank God, are remotely comparable to the differences that existed in 1861 between, part of the country that believed it was right, that humans had the right to own other human beings. I don't think, thank God, we're anything like that degree of hostility, or that degree of, let's just say, error. But we do have very, very deep problems. I think part of the answer for restoring trust is the way we've done it in the past, without having to come to conflict and to assert the importance of certain truths, we have had to look inward and to change. And I think that one of the things I talk about a little bit in the book is that in the very early days of the Republic, indeed for the first 50 years or so up to the Civil War, newspapers were incredibly partisan. I mean, they were, you still see it reflected in some of the names of newspapers, the Arkansas Democrat Gazette, or Republican Union leaders and things like this. You had they were nakedly partisan, and they were the only sources of information for many of the people who, largely for the people who read them. And we came to a position later in the 19th century, and certainly early in the 20th century, where actually people demanded something that was going to be, something that both sides could trust. We had to have some common ground. I feel quite strongly that will happen again, that we will need that. But I do think it will require, as far as news organizations are concerned, some changes. I do, again, agree with what Rod said about recognizing, being aware of our biases. I think it does require more diversity. I think it's, as I said earlier, it's absolutely right. We do need more ethnic and cultural diversity in our newsrooms, and we need to do that. But we also do really need more political and ideological diversity. And I think, and also the other things, geographic diversity and socioeconomic. We need newsrooms that look and think much more like the rest of the country, rather than living in these kind of bubbles of, frankly, kind of, I hate the word elitist, but these are bubbles of sort of elite kind of opinion. We need much more representative across on all these levels: ethnic, cultural, geographic, ideological, intellectual. We need much more diversity, and we should strive for that, and I hope we will.
Okay, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank all of you for participating in this discussion on media trust in a post-truth era. For those of you who are new to the Deadline Club, I'd encourage you to check us out online at deadlineclub.org. Serving New York journalists since 1925, one of SPJ's largest chapters, the Deadline Club is dedicated to perpetuating freedom of the press, encouraging the highest standards of excellence and ethics, and fostering career development through its awards, scholarships, workshops, talks like these, and social networking mixers. If you missed any part of tonight's discussion, you can go to deadlineclub.org to access the replay right from the homepage. It won't be up immediately, but it will be up in the coming days. It will also be available on our YouTube channel, and you see the address right at the bottom there, youtube.com/user/club deadline. We will be keeping the chat room on this webinar open until 8:45 Eastern time this evening, if you would like to comment on what you saw and heard. Again, a final thanks to our panelists, Gerard Baker, Rod Hicks, and Joy Mayer, to Jessica Siegel, our program chair, Peter Zeke, our president, and to our digital guru who got us online tonight, Deadline Club past president Bob Anthony. let me close, if I could, with the best working definition of truth I could find among those 2.9 billion results, which I mentioned earlier, that Google returned. It's the Wikipedia entry. Truth is the property of being in accord with fact or reality. Seeking truth out and reporting it should be job one for all of us. Edward R. Murrow said it best. To be persuasive, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. And to be credible, we must be truthful. For the Deadline Club, I'm Steve Dunlop. And to borrow another Murrowism, good night and good luck.